When we look at artificial intelligence, we see that it is in almost every facet of our life. But when we look at it, when it comes to work and labor, how will artificial intelligence and automated labor affect U.S. Mexico relationships? That was a central question at the Baker Institute's Center for the U.S. and Mexico's inaugural symposium for its new AI Policy and Governance Initiative. The symposium was held back in February, but the key findings of the symposium, which included artificial intelligence experts from the U.S. and Latin America, were recently released by the Baker Institute. To tell us more, we welcome Rodrigo Ferreira. He's an assistant teaching professor in computer science at Rice University and a faculty scholar at the Baker Institute. If you have questions for Rodrigo about how artificial intelligence and automation will affect U.S. Mexico trade relations, give us a call now at 713-440-8870. Welcome to Hello Houston, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Celeste. Thank you very much for having me. It's my
Well,
pleasure.
we're glad you're here. So what brought on this study to begin with?
Yes, absolutely. So last year at the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, we launched this initiative on AI policy and governance. The reason for that is that, well, AI is everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody wants us using AI all the time. And it's increasingly a marker of business development and economic success and government readiness. So at the Baker Institute, which is a top research institution on matters of foreign policy, particularly with Mexico and with Latin America, what we wanted to do was to think about these things together. Right? So at the Center for the U.S. and Mexico, for instance, there's a lot of research as it refers to immigration, labor, trade across the Americas. But how can we think about that in relationship to AI? So a very specific example that we wanted to look at was questions about AI automation and employment, right? People in the U.S. are very worried about what AI might be doing to their jobs, right? Some people have utopian fantasies about it. Some people are very concerned. But where's the gray area? Everything in between. And how does it affect people in other parts of the world? Right. So not just thinking about the future of work, but the futures of work.
So when you talk about the future of work, you're specifically talking about labor workers. Is that correct?
Well, this is the thing with AI, right? That historically there have been a lot of concerns about technology as it refers more to manual labor of sorts or manufacturing, right? The kinds of things that you could do with your hands.
So more robotics.
People historically were more concerned about robotics, right? But now, over the past few years, with recent innovations in AI, it's not just about robotics. It's also about creative work. It's also about the kind of information management work, right? So how AI can now do certain things as it refers to computation, as it refers to communication, information management. That's been raising a whole lot new questions.
So how different is this then than when we look at the Industrial Revolution? Is this like the AI revolution when it comes to workforce?
Well, some people love talking about it as the AI revolution, right? But as you point out, it's really a part of a longer history, right? And it's been part of a longer history about these kinds of fears, which have brought up obviously increased production and wealth and resources. But the concerns on the other side are also genuine, right? In that, well, as people's jobs are automated and more wealth and resources are produced, well, are those wealth and resources then trickling back down to those workers?
Well, I always hear that it's not so much AI that's going to replace workers. It's the person who understands AI that's going to replace that worker.
Yeah.
So is the education to people in Latin America and Mexico about AI, is that part of what's lacking?
Well, it's a complicated question because, again, these technologies have different effects in different parts of the world. So, for instance, one of the cases that we looked at was if you go back a few years and you think about on-demand gig work platforms, so like Uber, for instance, right? Something like that, which is obviously uses AI and algorithmic management to create all these recommendations, right? You have something like that in Latin America. And from a certain perspective, as it is here in the United States, it's like, well, this is great. This is creating economic opportunities for employment, right? Even as Uber puts it, you can be your own boss. So it sounds like a very attractive form of employment.
And in any city. I've used Uber in Mexico City. I've used it in Puerto Vallarta, Cancun. I mean, it's all over Mexico.
Yes, absolutely. Well, in Cancun, there's been some interesting complexities, which I can talk
Lord.
about.
Okay, well, that's a different river we'll go down. But go ahead. Good.
But what's happened, for instance, is that in Mexico, in Latin America, these kinds of platforms have been adopted to a much larger percentage that they have here in the United States, not as an additional form of income, but as a kind of full-time employment. And the consequences of that are, again, on the one hand, there's increased economic opportunities and employment, but on the other hand, in many countries in Latin America, you don't get some of the safety net that you get here in the United States. Mm-hmm. So as it refers to medical benefits, for instance, as it refers to unemployment benefits, for instance. So in the absence of full-time employment that can provide that for you, workers in Latin America are left off in a much more precarious situation. And, going back to the situation with Cancun, for instance, in some cases, even crime and violence and discrimination.
I'm sorry.
No,
I was going to say, so with AI coming into the marketplace as it has, are there unique challenges that Mexico would be facing that the U.S. wouldn't? Or are we all dealing with very similar problems and maybe our approaches of how we're dealing with them are different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think both situations are true, right? In that, as it stands right now, there's a lot of questions as to exactly how AI will impact labor markets across the world, right? Mm-hmm. But we also know, and this is something that scholars love talking about, that AI is really neither artificial nor intelligent.
Shut that one down.
Well, again, to me, this is the interesting dynamics, right? Because, what defines something being artificial? It's really people's work that is putting this together, right? And it's material resources that are needed to build the technologies. Right. A lot of natural resources go into the everyday usage of AI, right? And again, we talk about intelligence insofar as it's able to do certain things very well, obviously not able to do a lot of things, right?
You're listening to Hello Houston. We're speaking with Rodrigo Ferreira. I apologize. I think I just cut you off. I thought you were pausing. Rodrigo Ferreira is an assistant teaching professor in computer science at Rice University. We're talking about AI and how it affects labor and working relationships between the U.S. and Mexico. You can join the conversation at 713-440-8870. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you continue
Yes,
along the line about where the differences or the uniquenesses between the U.S. and Mexico happen in the AI world?
Yes. Okay, so this is part of what we're looking at, right? Because as I've said, there have been some historical differences as it refers to robotics. So there, for instance, people were expecting a lot of jobs in Latin America to be overtaken by robots. Robots ended up being more expensive, right? So again, people kept hiring the kind of cheap labor that is available in those countries, right? I mentioned already the case with on-demand gig platforms such as Uber. And now, again, what we're very interested in is understanding more of these implications as it refers to AI and to generative AI.
I want to get to the point, though, is there a unique set of circumstances that maybe Mexico faces or the U.S. faces where aren't similar, or are they the same issues we face?
Yes, so what we're encountering so far in Latin America is that the high-skilled sector, right? So those kinds of creative or information management workers is a class that is relatively smaller in Latin America than what it is in the U.S., right? Mm-hmm. So whereas, again, here in the U.S., there's a lot of concerns for those people losing their jobs. In Latin America, what we're seeing is that they're actually quite benefiting from the increased productivity and wealth, right? There's so relatively less opportunities for employment for these high-skilled workers in Latin America. And again, the concentration of wealth is so much higher that these technologies are driving up inequities, and at least much more clearly so than what we're seeing in the U.S.
And so one of the challenges that you mentioned is as you are seeing these opportunities grow in Mexico, one of the issues that Latin America has that perhaps the U.S. doesn't have is the regulation and safety for these employees. Now, in Mexico, a recent reform was passed by the Senate, which aims to guarantee on-demand workers Social Security benefits, similar to those to full-time employees. You mentioned this. But is this going to work for providing it, or is it still unclear? How is that going to improve regulation and rules and safety for workers in Mexico?
Yes, so that's a big question right now, right? Because this law was only recently implemented, and again, the impetus for it is that, well, again, given the particular dynamics that you find in Mexico, given that such a large percentage of the population is engaged in this kind of gig work, that you would want to be able to provide those benefits and security to those workers, right? But again, that implies a heavier cost for the companies that then would have to provide it, right? So the big question now is, are companies going to be willing and able to do so? Or instead, are they going to retract, right? Are they going to withdraw from those markets, right? And offer less of those opportunities. On the other hand, they might pass down some of those costs to the workers themselves, right? So they might take it out of their commission, for instance, such that then the workers end up getting a lesser salary and it becomes less of an attractive opportunity. So these are some of the trade-offs that have been discussed. Again, I would think that it's very important to be able to offer those minimum securities for workers, but the companies have to cooperate.
It's one of the complaints I hear from Uber drivers here in America is that a $40 ride, they only get $7 of it, for example.
Yes.
And then Uber or whoever gets the rest of it. So that kind of an issue, if Uber was taking some of that money and actually setting up some kind of pension for those workers, that would be a positive, right?
Yes, yes.
So what do you think the good solutions to this are? Or did you just identify the problems, or did you also try to work toward the solutions?
Well, that's precisely the complex issue here at stake, right? Because, for instance, Uber's technology, right? It provides this great benefit, in theory, for workers and for riders as well, right? So in many ways, this is exactly what we would want out of technology, that it makes our life easier, more convenient, creates more opportunities for employment, etc. But as you said, the issue is that, well, a big part of the potential profits that are there are being taken in by the company, right? So either by Uber or by other companies in similar lines of business. And that, again, is going to the executives or to the investors, right? So again, what were to happen if we were to take that technology but implement it in a different structure, in a different model, where more of that goes back to the workers, right? So there's a lot of avenues for research there and possibilities in terms of thinking about how we could open up those new modes of using that same technology but in a different way.
Now, Rodrigo, we did get a text with a question that says, in a world increasingly shaped by algorithms, how do we ensure that the human values guiding AI development remain front and center so that technology serves humanity rather than the other way around?
Yes, absolutely. So that's one of the points that we actually looked at in our research report that was recently published. A lot of research historically talks about AI exposure very broadly. So whoever it is that in their work somehow uses AI, right? But again, the interest is maybe that we can look at that with a little bit more nuance, right? You can think about aspects of AI either complementing or augmenting human capacities, and other aspects replacing human capacities. So in theory, we would want technologies, we would want AI that can help us enhance those human aspects that we want, such as critical thinking, creative thinking, empathy and communication and such, right? We don't want those to be replaced, right? We want maybe technology to help us offload other things so we can focus on what matters. So again, one of the recommendations that we're making is based upon this kind of research that draws this distinction between those two dimensions of AI, thinking about how can we isolate and identify those aspects of technology and then promote those. Right.
So based on the recommendations that you just talked, you touched on one, but there were actually three that the symposium developed and saw, and one of them was develop new mechanisms for policy, innovation, and experimentation.
Yes.
So how would you implement that basically on both sides of the border? When you're looking at U.S. policy and regulation, would there be some type of conversations? How does that work to ensure that if you have a U.S. company going to Mexico, that they're going to follow rules and regulations, and that if you do have workers coming over here as well, that they are going to follow rules and regulation around AI?
Yes, absolutely. So that comes from international cooperation, right? That comes from there being a dialogue between policymakers in the U.S. and in Mexico and in other parts of the world to ensure that, again, the working conditions are able to provide some kind of minimum security and benefits for workers on both sides, right?
Continue. Yeah.
Well, there has to be the space for dialogue for that, right? And again, U.S. foreign policy is changing. It's been lately more difficult precisely to think about international cooperation. So this is something that we're very much encouraging, for there to be this dialogue and exchange between policymakers and researchers from the U.S., from Mexico, and from other parts of Latin America and from the world.
Are these issues you're exploring absolutely unique to AI, or are they the same issues and struggles we have with technology in general when new technologies are introduced?
Yeah. So again, I think that there are some specificities about AI, but from a broader perspective, there's a continuity between many of these technologies that we have encountered and the questions they raise. Again, for instance, when gig platforms became popular, we weren't talking so much about AI, even though they were an essential part of it, right? Talking about social media, talking about cryptocurrencies, right? Thinking about transportation automation of all sorts, right? I think that all of these questions emerge in these different areas. Right now, the locus of conversation is around AI. But again, some of these questions around labor and distribution of resources and safety and security emerge across all different technological innovations.
Also, culturally, Rodrigo, in the U.S., we are very much vocal about our rights and what we believe in, and we have education through 12th grade. In Mexico and many Latin American countries, education stops in 8th grade, 6th grade. How are you making sure that labor workers understand, or what would your recommendation be to policymakers and companies in Latin America, making sure that their laborers understand their rights to understanding AI and how it is working and how it can work for them?
Yeah, so 2 points there. No, one is that obviously something that we're promoting is for higher education and higher sharing of educational resources across borders, right? So we want to make sure that people in the U.S., in Mexico, and in other parts of Latin America are able to receive the education that they need to succeed in this world, right? That includes literacy on AI and other technologies, right? But then the other point, which is what we're seeing, is that there is a large amount of high-skilled workers in Mexico and in Latin America, right? So people are coming prepared to be able to work in these areas. The problem is that either there's not enough opportunities of employment for there in Mexico and Latin America, or they end up preferring, or up until recently, coming here to the United States, right?
Another text we got. This is such a great discussion, so there you are. I'm curious if there is a way AI could be implemented for social good.
Oh, yes. So, so that's precisely all the work that we're doing, right? Because again, to me, the most fundamental question here is, what is all this technology for, right? Obviously, we wanted to make our lives easier, to make our lives more convenient, right? We wanted to make us more productive. But again, to me, there's no point in technological innovation if the majority of the benefits and profits are going to just a very small portion of the population, right? To me, thinking about AI or technology for social good is thinking about the social, economic, and political structures that exist around these technologies to make sure that those benefits are more equitably distributed.
We did get a YouTube comment that says, I am an IT professional and use AI frequently. The one thing that needs to be understood is that the current AI can make mistakes, so it must verify the results. Also, the AI providers are constantly updating and often introducing new errors. How would you address that comment?
Yeah. So I would first of all like to compliment the person who posted that, right? Because what that demonstrates is a care for truth and a care for honesty, right? And a care for doing things with a certain degree of care and attention, right? And unfortunately, again, culture is shifting and the technology's role in culture is shifting, where oftentimes people are misled into the idea that more is necessarily better, right? So just producing things without necessarily a regard for quality or, again, for their truthfulness, right? And again, AI facilitates that. It can do a lot very quickly, right? But again, from my mind, it's very important that maybe we take a moment to reflect upon, well, why are we creating so much of these things and why? And again, how can we remain attached to those values that we care about, including truth?
If you just ask ChatGPT to write your resume, you'll see how wrong it can be.
Yeah.
But I want everyone to keep in mind, and I'm sure you'll agree on this, is that it gets better every day. It's going to learn to find those errors. This is just the first steps in the world of AI. Who knows where it's leading?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true, right? So over time, it will become more accurate, right? But I think that a bigger question there too is, well, what kind of communication is this? You know, when we sit here, it's not just about communicating truth, right? It's also about being able to converse, right? To empathize, to speculate together. There's so much more about communication beyond just reporting whatever is.
It'll learn it, I fear.
Now, Rodrigo, like the U.S., we recently have a new presidential administration. Mexico has a new presidential administration, Claudia Sheinbaum. Do you think that she is making and moving forward policy that will help the labor breach, the labor workforce and AI in Mexico?
I know that there's a lot of interest in it, and not only at the federal level, but also at the state level. So, for instance, at an event, we had representatives from the state of Jalisco, for instance, right? And we also know that there's local Senate initiatives that are pushing forth these kinds of ideas. And in civil society, a lot of people precisely interested in better understanding AI and it having a positive impact on Mexican society and Mexican workers. So again, I think that a big question remains as to how all of these different synergies can come together, whether there will be enough government support for them, right? Or whether the civil society will be the one who will have to continue to push through on them.
Wow.
Rodrigo Ferreira is an assistant teaching professor in computer science at Rice University and a faculty scholar at the Baker Institute. Rodrigo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.